The morning Ilara Whitmore learned she was to become a duchess, the sky wept as though mourning on her behalf. Rain streaked down the tall windows of Whitmore House, tracing silver paths along glass that had witnessed 3 generations of quiet respectability and now bore witness to its greatest sacrifice. She stood in her father's study, a room that smelled of leather-bound books and pipe tobacco, where dust motes danced in what little grey light penetrated the storm clouds. Her father sat behind his mahogany desk, his face bearing the particular shade of shame that comes from a man who has gambled away not only his fortune, but his daughter's future in the same reckless hand. "The Duke of Blackthorn," she repeated, her voice steady despite the tremor that threatened to betray her. "You promised me to the Duke of Blackthorn." Harold Whitmore could not meet her eyes. He shuffled papers that required no shuffling, straightened inkwells that stood perfectly aligned, performed the fidgeting rituals of a guilty conscience. "It was the only way, Ilara. The debts, you cannot comprehend the magnitude. We would have lost everything. The house, the lands, your mother's security, your sister's prospects, everything. And so you sold me instead." The words hung between them, sharp as broken crystal. Ilara had always known her father was weak. She had watched him make poor investments, trusted dubious associates, and chased dreams that evaporated like morning mist. But she had never imagined he would trade her like livestock at an auction. The Duke was amenable to the arrangement, her father continued, his voice taking on a desperate quality. "He agreed to settle all debts, provide generous dowries for your sisters, ensure your mother wants for nothing. In exchange for me." Ilara turned to face the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. Beyond the rain she could see the gardens where she had played as a child, the rose arbor where she had dreamed of someday standing beside a man who loved her, pledging vows that meant something beyond commerce and desperation. "What do you know of him? Truly know, not the whispers and speculation." Her father's silence stretched long enough to confirm her worst fears. "Father, they say he is formidable," Harold finally offered. "Brilliant in matters of business and politics, the wealthiest peer in England, perhaps in all of Europe. His estates are vast, his influence unmatched. I did not ask about his ledgers, I asked about the man." Another painful silence. When her father spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "They say he has never lost a negotiation, never showed mercy to an adversary, never allowed sentiment to cloud his judgment. They say those who cross him disappear from society so completely it is as though they never existed at all. They call him the Iron Duke, Ilara, not for his military service, but for the metal they claim runs through his veins where blood should be." Ilara closed her eyes. She had heard the rumors, of course, all of London had heard them. The Duke of Blackthorn was a spectre that haunted ballrooms and drawing rooms alike. Spoken of in hushed tones, feared, fascinating, and forever absent from the social occasions that would have required him to perform the niceties of polite company. Some said he had killed a man in a duel over a perceived slight, so minor no one could remember what it was. Others whispered that his first wife, had there been a first wife, had died under mysterious circumstances. Still others claimed he practiced dark arts in the depths of his ancestral estate, Blackthorn Manor, a fortress of black stone perched on the Yorkshire moors like a curse given architectural form. "When?" she asked, not trusting herself to say more. 3 weeks. He wishes to be married before the season ends. The ceremony will take place at his estate, private, with only immediate family in attendance. 3 weeks. 21 days to prepare herself for a lifetime chained to a monster. Ilara opened her eyes and turned back to face her father. Whatever he saw in her expression made him flinch. "You have made your choice," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Now you must live with it. But know this, father, I will never forgive you. Not for the arrangement itself, because I understand desperation even as I despise it, but for your cowardice, for negotiating my entire existence as though I were surplus furniture, for never once asking me if I might have found another solution, another way, another path that did not lead directly into darkness." She left him there, surrounded by his books and his shame, and walked through the corridors of the only home she had ever known with the measured steps of a woman proceeding toward her own execution. The 3 weeks passed in a blur of silk and lace, of dress fittings and tearful farewells, of her mother's strained smiles and her younger sister's wide, frightened eyes. Margaret at 16 and Catherine at 14 understood enough to recognize that their eldest sister was being sacrificed for their benefit. They clung to her during quiet moments, promising to write every day, begging her to send word if she needed rescue. As though anyone could rescue her from the most powerful man in England. On the morning of her departure, Ilara dressed in her traveling clothes with deliberate care, a deep blue dress that brought out the unusual grey-green of her eyes, her chestnut hair pinned beneath a modest bonnet, her mother's pearl earrings the only adornment she allowed herself. If she was to meet her doom, she would do so looking every inch the gentleman's daughter she had been raised to be. The carriage that arrived to collect her was black as a hearse, pulled by 4 matched horses, whose coats gleamed like oil in the watery sunshine. A footman in severe livery opened the door, his face expressionless as carved marble. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the words were not a greeting but a confirmation. She embraced her mother one last time, felt the wetness of tears against her cheek, heard the choked words of love and regret. Her sisters each pressed a token into her hands, a pressed flower from Margaret, a small portrait of the 3 of them together from Catherine. Her father stood apart, and when their eyes met, he looked away first. The carriage interior was far more luxurious than she had expected, upholstered in velvet the color of midnight, with fur throws against the early spring chill, and a small brazier providing warmth. A basket of refreshments sat on the seat across from her, fine cheeses, fresh bread, hothouse fruits, a bottle of wine. Her captor, it seemed, believed in comfortable captivity. The journey to Yorkshire took 3 days, each mile carrying her further from everything familiar and closer to her unknown fate. She watched the landscape change through the carriage windows, the gentle green hills of the south giving way to wilder, bleaker terrain. The villages grew smaller and more sparse. The trees bent sideways, shaped by winds that never ceased. By the 3rd day she travelled through a world of heath and stone that seemed to belong to a different age entirely, ancient and unyielding and utterly indifferent to human concerns. She saw Blackthorn Manor before she was ready. The carriage crested a hill, and there it was, rising from the moors like a declaration of war against the sky itself. Black stone, just as the rumours claimed, though she could see now that it was less true black than the deep grey of storm clouds, shot through with veins of darker mineral that caught what little light filtered through the overcast afternoon. Towers rose at each corner of the main structure, and countless windows stared outward like watchful eyes. It was enormous, ancient, and absolutely terrifying in its grandeur. The carriage passed through iron gates bearing the blackthorn crest, a leafless tree struck by lightning, still standing despite its wounds, and began the long approach up a drive lined with actual blackthorn bushes, their twisted branches reaching toward the carriage like skeletal fingers. By the time they reached the front entrance, Ilara had composed herself as thoroughly as her hammering heart would allow. She would not show fear. Whatever waited for her inside those imposing doors, she would face it with the dignity her mother had instilled in her, and the stubborn pride that was entirely her own. The door opened. A butler appeared, ancient and upright, his silver hair immaculate, and his expression suggesting that he had witnessed centuries of human folly and remained determinedly unimpressed. "Miss Whitmore, welcome to Blackthorn Manor. I am Thornton. His Grace awaits you in the library." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had hoped for some time to gather herself, to see her rooms, to prepare. Instead, she was to be thrown immediately before the lion. Very well. She followed Thornton through a grand entrance hall that could have housed her entire childhood home, past suits of armor that stood sentinel along the walls, beneath portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to track her progress with cold assessment. The manor was not merely old, it was ancient, its stones steeped in so much history that the weight of it pressed against her like a physical presence. The library doors were twice her height, carved with elaborate scenes she could not decipher in her distracted state. Thornton knocked once, received some signal she did not hear, and pushed them open. "Miss Ilara Whitmore, Your Grace." The room beyond was cavernous, its walls lined floor to ceiling with books that must have numbered in the tens of thousands. A fire blazed in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, casting dancing shadows across Persian carpets and leather furniture. The windows were tall and narrow, admitting grey light that competed poorly with the flames, and standing before those windows, silhouetted against the dying afternoon, was the Duke of Blackthorn. He turned. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, and she hated herself for it. The rumors had painted him as monstrous, deformed, aged, cruel-faced. The reality was something else entirely, something far more dangerous than any of those comfortable simplicities. Julian Thorne, the 7th Duke of Blackthorn, was perhaps 35 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean, muscular build of a man who rode and fenced and did not allow himself the soft indulgences of the typical aristocrat. His hair was dark as his stone walls, thick and slightly longer than fashion dictated, swept back from a face of sharp planes and angles that belonged on a Renaissance sculpture. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a nose that had been broken at least once and healed imperfectly, the only flaw in an otherwise arresting countenance, but it was his eyes that made her forget to breathe entirely. Dark as midnight, yes, but not cold as she had expected. Something burned in their depths, something she could not name, something that made her feel as though she had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The wind moaned against the ancient windows. Somewhere distant, a clock began to chime the hour. Then the Duke smiled, and it transformed his severe features into something almost human. Almost. "Miss Whitmore, or may I call you Ilara? Given that we are to be married in 2 days, formality seems excessive." His voice was deep, rich, touched with an accent she could not place, something that suggested he had travelled far beyond England's shores, learned languages and customs that coloured his speech in subtle ways. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed, but there was nothing harsh in it, not yet. "Your Grace may call me whatever Your Grace prefers," she replied, proud that her voice did not waver. "I am, after all, here at Your Grace's pleasure." Something flickered in those dark eyes. Amusement? Approval? She could not tell. "I see the rumors of your spirit were not exaggerated." He gestured to a pair of chairs arranged before the fire. "Please sit. You must be exhausted from your journey. I apologize for summoning you directly upon your arrival, but I confess I was eager to meet you." Eager. An interesting choice of words for a man who had purchased a bride like a prized horse. Ilara sat, arranging her skirts with mechanical precision, and watched as the Duke claimed the chair opposite her. Up close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the suggestion of silver at his temples, the small scar that bisected his left eyebrow. He was not merely handsome, he was compelling in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. Monsters were supposed to look like monsters. They were not supposed to have faces that made you want to study them for hours, cataloguing every detail. "You are not what I expected," she said, before she could stop herself. "Nor are you." His gaze traveled over her face with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and appreciated. "I expected a frightened child, weeping and begging to be released from our arrangement. Instead, I find a woman who meets my eyes without flinching and speaks her mind without permission. Tell me, Ilara, do you hate me already, or are you reserving judgment until you have more evidence?" The directness startled her into honesty. "I have not decided. I know what they say about you, but I have learned that rumors are often more fiction than fact. I also know what you have done, purchasing my father's debts specifically to acquire me as part of the settlement. That speaks to either obsession or strategy, and I am not yet certain which is more alarming." The Duke laughed, and the sound was so unexpected that Ilara nearly dropped her composure entirely. It was a real laugh, warm and surprised, as though genuine amusement was rare enough in his life that it caught even him off guard. "Both," he admitted. "Strategy first. I needed a wife, and the usual methods of acquiring one were unsuitable. I cannot tolerate simpering debutantes who faint at harsh language and dream only of my title and fortune." I needed someone with steel in her spine, intelligence in her eyes, and absolutely no interest in loving me. Your father's debts provided an opportunity. A woman bound by obligation could not claim I had misled her with pretty courtships and false promises. And the obsession? His smile faded, replaced by something more serious, more vulnerable. For a moment the mask slipped, and she glimpsed something underneath that made her heart stutter. I saw you once, he said quietly. At the Harrington Ball, 2 seasons past. You were standing by the windows, watching the dancers with an expression I recognized, the look of someone who sees the performance for what it is, and finds it both fascinating and faintly ridiculous. You had no idea I was there. No one ever expects me at such events, and I prefer the shadows where I can observe without being observed. I watched you for an hour, Ilara. Watched you refuse 3 dance invitations from men who clearly bored you. Watched you slip outside to the gardens and stand alone under the stars. Watched you return with leaves in your hair and a secret smile on your lips, as though you had discovered something wonderful that no one else could see. Ilara remembered that night. She had escaped the stifling ballroom to explore the Harrington Gardens, found a hidden pond where frogs sang in the darkness, sat on a stone bench, and imagined a life very different from the one society expected of her. It had been a small rebellion, a stolen moment of freedom, and he had been watching. I decided then, the Duke continued, that if I ever married, it would be to a woman who looked at the world the way you did that night, with wonder and skepticism in equal measure, with a hunger for something real beneath all the artifice. It took me 2 years to arrange circumstances that would bring you here. I am many things, Ilara, but I am not patient when I want something. And I wanted you. She should have been horrified. She should have felt the violation of it, the calculated manipulation. Instead, she felt something far more dangerous, intrigue. You speak as though you have already decided everything about our future, she said carefully. But you do not know me. You saw a girl at a window and constructed an entire fantasy around her. What if the reality disappoints? What if I am not the woman you imagined? Then I will adjust my expectations. His voice was matter-of-fact, as though discussing a minor change in dinner plans rather than the entire foundation of their impending marriage. I am not so foolish as to believe that 1 hour of observation could reveal the totality of a person. You will surprise me, disappoint me, frustrate me, and quite possibly drive me to madness. I am counting on it. Why? The question emerged before she could contain it. Not the questions she should be asking about her duties, her allowances, the terms of their arrangement, but the question that had been burning in her since she first heard his name, connected to her fate. Why me? Why go to such elaborate lengths? Why not simply take what the world would have given him, any woman he wanted, falling at his feet for the privilege of becoming his duchess? The Duke rose from his chair and crossed to a sideboard where crystal decanters caught the firelight. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid and returned, pressing one into her hands. She noted that he did not ask if she wanted it, did not assume she would refuse. He simply offered, as though certain she was capable of making her own choices. Because I am tired of being feared, he said, resuming his seat. Because I have spent my entire life playing the role the world assigned me, the heartless duke, the cruel strategist, the man without mercy or conscience. That reputation serves me well in matters of business and politics. It keeps enemies at a distance and ensures that no one dares move against me. But it is lonely, Ilara. Profoundly, devastatingly lonely. He took a long drink from his glass, staring into the fire. I do not want a wife who obeys me because she fears what I might do if she refuses. I do not want a woman who smiles and simpers and agrees with everything I say because she believes it will keep her safe. I want... He stopped, laughed bitterly at himself. What I want is probably impossible. A true partner. Someone who sees beyond the monster and finds whatever remains of the man. Someone who challenges me, argues with me, looks at me like I am human and deserving of something more than terror. Love, Ilara said softly. You want love. He flinched as though she had struck him. I told you, impossible. One cannot purchase love, and I am not naive enough to expect it. But perhaps understanding, respect, a connection that is not built entirely on fear and obligation. His dark eyes found hers again. I saw something in you that night, Ilara. A capacity for seeing clearly, for finding truth beneath surfaces. I am gambling everything that you might be able to look at me, truly look, and find something worth knowing. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Ilara raised her glass and took a careful sip, letting the warmth of brandy spread through her chest as she considered the extraordinary confession she had just received. The most feared man in England was lonely. The Iron Duke wanted to be seen as human. Her future husband was not seeking obedience, he was seeking connection. It changed nothing and everything simultaneously. I will not pretend to love you, she said finally. I will not perform affection I do not feel or speak words that are not true. If honesty is what you value, then honesty is what you will receive, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it angers you. I am told you do not accept no for an answer. You may find that I do not accept demands for my emotions, no matter how powerful the man making them. I would expect nothing less. But, she held up her hand when he started to speak, I am also not unreasonable. I understand the position I am in, and I have no desire to spend my life at war with my own husband. If you prove to be something other than the monster the world believes you to be, if you treat me with the respect you claim to want, then perhaps we can build something livable from this arrangement. Not love, perhaps, but not hatred either. The Duke, Julian, she supposed she should start thinking of him by his name, inclined his head in acknowledgement. A fair offer, more generous than I deserve given how this began. Yes, she agreed, it is. For the first time since she had entered the library, something in his expression softened into what might almost be warmth. You really are extraordinary. I am practical. There is a difference. The first of many lessons you will teach me, I suspect. He rose and offered his hand. Come, I will show you to your rooms. Tomorrow we'll be busy with preparations for the ceremony, but tonight you should rest. We have a lifetime ahead of us for conversation. She took his hand, strong, warm, surprisingly gentle, and allowed him to help her rise. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through her, electricity where she had expected only cold obligation. She released his fingers quickly, perhaps too quickly, and saw his mouth quirk with knowing amusement. One more thing, he said, as they walked toward the library doors. The rumors about me, most of them are true. I have ruined men who crossed me. I have shown no mercy to enemies. I have done things in pursuit of my goals that would horrify you if you knew the details. I am telling you this not to frighten you, but so there are no illusions between us. I am not a good man, Ilara, but I am trying, perhaps for the first time in my life, to be something better than the monster they made me. She looked up at him, this complicated, dangerous, unexpectedly vulnerable man who had purchased her like property and then asked for her understanding rather than her submission. Then we are both trying something new, she replied. I have never been a duchess. You have never been whatever it is you are attempting to become. Perhaps we can learn together. The smile he gave her was small, tentative, wholly unlike the sharp-edged expression he had worn when she entered. It made him look younger, almost innocent, if such a word could ever apply to a man like Julian Thorne. Together, he repeated, as though the word was foreign and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Yes, I think I would like that. He led her through the labyrinthine corridors of Blackthorn Manor, and as they walked, Ilara began to notice details she had missed in her initial terror. The walls were hung not just with stern ancestors, but with beautiful landscapes, delicate watercolors that seemed completely at odds with the manor's forbidding exterior. Fresh flowers brightened alcoves and tables, hothouse blooms in the midst of the Yorkshire spring, carefully tended. The staff they passed bowed or curtsied, with what appeared to be genuine respect rather than fearful deference. You seem surprised, Julian observed, noting her wandering attention. I expected something darker, she admitted. The manor from the outside appears designed to intimidate, but inside I live, he finished. The exterior serves its purpose. It keeps away those who have no business here and confirms the expectations of those who already fear me. But I spend my life within these walls. I saw no reason to make them as cold as my reputation. They climbed a grand staircase, passed through a gallery hung with artwork that would have been the pride of any London collection, and finally stopped before a door of carved oak. "Your chambers," Julian said. "They connect to mine through a shared sitting room, but the doors lock from both sides. You will have complete privacy unless you choose otherwise. Your belongings have already been brought up, and a maid has been assigned to attend you. Her name is Mary, and she has been with the household since she was 14. She is utterly loyal and will answer any questions you have about the manor, the staff, or my household. I have instructed her to be entirely honest with you." "Even about you?" "Especially about me." He gave a small bow. "Dinner is at 8. You may join me in the dining room, or if you prefer, I will have a tray sent up." "I would not blame you for wanting solitude tonight," Ilara considered. The practical thing would be to retreat, to gather her strength, to prepare for the overwhelming days ahead. But she had spent 3 days in a carriage, with nothing but her fears for company, and she found herself unexpectedly reluctant to return to that isolation. "I will join you for dinner," she decided, "though I may not be brilliant company." "You need not be brilliant. You need only be present." He reached for the door handle, paused. "Ilara, thank you for listening, for not running screaming from the library the moment you had the chance. I know this is not the life you wanted, but I intend to do everything in my power to ensure it is not the prison you fear." He opened the door and stepped aside, allowing her to enter first. The chambers beyond were beautiful, spacious rooms decorated in soft blues and creams. A 4-poster bed hung with silk curtains, windows overlooking what appeared to be a private garden. Fresh flowers sat on every surface, filling the air with sweetness. "Until dinner, then," Julian said from the doorway, and was gone before she could respond. Ilara stood in the center of her new prison, because that was what it was, no matter how lovely the furnishings, and tried to reconcile everything she had just experienced with everything she had expected. The Duke of Blackthorn was not the monster of legend. He was something far more complicated and far more dangerous, because a monster could be hated without complication. A monster could be feared and resented and kept at emotional distance. But a man who admitted his loneliness, acknowledged his flaws, asked for understanding instead of demanding submission. A man who watched her at a ball for an hour and remembered the leaves in her hair 2 years later. That man could become something else entirely. And as Ilara began to unpack her belongings in the chambers that would be her home for the rest of her life, she felt the first small crack form in the walls she had built around her heart. Walls she had thought impenetrable, walls she had counted on to protect her. The marriage had not yet begun, and already the battle was being lost. The wedding took place on a grey afternoon in the ancient chapel attached to Blackthorn Manor. Stone walls rose around Ilara like a fortress, and stained glass windows cast coloured shadows across the floor, painting her white dress with fragments of saints and sinners. Her family had made the journey, her mother weeping, her sisters clinging to each other, her father standing apart with his guilt written across his features. The ceremony itself was brief, conducted by a minister who had clearly performed this office for generations of Blackthorns and seemed entirely unsurprised by the bride's subdued demeanour or the groom's intense focus. Ilara spoke her vows in a clear voice that betrayed nothing of her inner turmoil. Julian spoke his with a fervour that seemed almost inappropriate for what was, after all, a business arrangement. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, a stunning piece of antique gold set with diamonds that must have been worn by duchess after duchess before her, his hands were steady, but his eyes burned with something that made her breath catch. "With this ring, I thee wed," he said, and the words sounded less like ritual than like promise, like warning, like prophecy. And then it was done. She was the Duchess of Blackthorn, wife to the most feared man in England, prisoner of her father's debts, and her own stubborn determination to make the best of an impossible situation. The wedding breakfast that followed was a small affair. Only her family and a few of Julian's associates, none of whom seemed particularly close to him. Ilara smiled and nodded, and accepted congratulations and pretended not to notice the way everyone watched her husband with barely concealed unease. Even here, among people who presumably knew him well, the fear was palpable. By late afternoon, her family departed. Her mother's embrace was tight enough to crack ribs. Her sister's tearful promises to write made Ilara's own eyes burn with suppressed emotion. Even her father managed a few halting words of hope for her happiness, though they both knew he had forfeited any right to wish her well. And then they were gone, and Ilara stood on the steps of Blackthorn Manor beside her new husband, watching the carriages disappear down the long drive, and felt the full weight of her new reality settle onto her shoulders. "You handled that remarkably well," Julian observed. "Most new brides in your position would have collapsed into hysterics by now. Would you prefer hysterics? I can arrange them if it would make you more comfortable." He laughed, that surprised, genuine sound she had first heard in the library. "God, no. Your composure is one of the things I admire most about you, though I suspect it is costing you more than you would ever admit." He was right, of course. Beneath her calm exterior, Ilara was drowning in a sea of uncertainty and fear. But she had learned long ago that showing weakness invited exploitation, and she had no intention of being exploited. "What happens now?" she asked, turning to face him. His expression grew serious. "Now we begin the work of building a life together. The first weeks will be challenging. You must learn the household, meet the staff, understand the expectations that come with your new title. I will be as helpful as I can, but there are matters of business that require my attention. I trust you to manage in my absence. And our arrangement, the personal aspects of our marriage." Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I will make no demands of you. When and if you wish to share my bed, the decision will be entirely yours. I told you I do not want obedience born of obligation, and I meant it. You will come to me freely or not at all." The relief that flooded through her was followed immediately by something else, something that might have been disappointment, though she refused to examine it closely. "That is more generous than I expected. I am attempting to exceed expectations." He offered his arm. "Come, I believe dinner will be served shortly, and I have instructed the cook to prepare something special for our first meal as husband and wife. If nothing else, you will never go hungry in this house." They dined in a smaller room than the formal dining hall she had glimpsed during her initial tour, a cozy space with warm lighting and walls lined with shelves of curiosities. Julian explained that this was his private dining room, used only when he was alone or with intimate company. "You are now intimate company," he said, and the words carried a weight that made her skin warm. The food was excellent, far better than anything she had eaten at home, and the conversation flowed more easily than she would have predicted. Julian proved to be well-read, well-travelled, and possessed of a sharp wit that drew reluctant smiles from her despite her determination to remain guarded. He asked about her childhood, her education, her interests, and listened to her answers with an attention that felt almost uncomfortable in its intensity. In turn, he revealed fragments of his own history, his parents who had died when he was 18, leaving him to manage the duchy alone, his younger brother who had been killed in a riding accident a decade past, the crushing responsibility he had shouldered since before he was fully grown. "I was 20 when I earned my reputation," he said, staring into his wineglass as though it contained answers to questions she had not asked. "A group of investors attempted to defraud my family's interests through a scheme that would have cost us everything. They assumed I was too young, too inexperienced, too distracted by grief to notice what they were doing. I noticed. I dismantled their operation piece by piece, exposed their crimes, and ensured that every single one of them faced consequences so severe that no one would ever attempt such a thing again." "That does not seem unreasonable," Ilara said carefully. "They tried to steal from you. The consequences were comprehensive." Julian's voice went flat. "I did not simply stop them, I destroyed them. Their businesses, their reputations, their social standing, their families' prospects. I was thorough in a way that shocked even those who thought they understood what I was capable of. By the time I finished, they had nothing left. Some of them eventually recovered after years of struggle. Others never did." "And you regret it?" He looked up, meeting her eyes. I regret that I enjoyed it, that discovering how completely I could dismantle someone's life was exhilarating. I was young and angry and grieving, and I channeled all of that into becoming the monster they feared. And once you have that reputation, once people believe you are capable of anything, you find yourself living up to their expectations. Being the Iron Duke was easier than being Julian Thorne. The mask became more comfortable than the face beneath. Ilara considered this confession, the vulnerability of it, the self-awareness that spoke to years of private reckoning. And now I am tired of the mask. Now I look back at 20 years of strategic cruelty and wonder what I might have been if I had chosen differently. Now I have a wife who sees through pretense, and I find myself wanting to be the man she deserves rather than the monster she was promised. The candles had burned low, casting the room in intimate shadows. Ilara realized with a start that hours had passed, that she had been so engrossed in conversation that she had forgotten to be afraid. "It is late," Julian said, rising. "I should let you rest. Tomorrow I must ride out to inspect one of the tenant farms, but I will return by evening. If you need anything at all, the staff have been instructed to accommodate any request." He walked her to the door of her chambers, stopping at the threshold with an uncertainty that seemed entirely at odds with his formidable reputation. "Ilara, today was perhaps the best day I have experienced in a very long time. Thank you for that." Before she could respond, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Gentle, reverent, nothing like the demanding possession she had braced for. Then he released her and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor, like a ghost returning to its haunt. Ilara stood in her doorway, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched, and felt something shift in her chest, a lock turning, a door opening. The first tentative suggestion of a path she had not expected to find. She closed the door, leaned against it, and pressed her palm to her racing heart. This was dangerous. This unexpected kindness, this vulnerability, this man who had been promised as her doom but was proving to be something else entirely. If she was not careful, she would lose herself in him, fall into the darkness of his world and forget everything she had been before. But as she prepared for bed in her beautiful chamber, surrounded by the evidence of his thoughtfulness and care, Ilara could not help but wonder if losing herself might not be the worst fate imaginable. Perhaps, in the right circumstances, it might even feel like being found. The first month of marriage taught Ilara that Blackthorn Manor was not merely a house. It was a kingdom unto itself, with its own laws, customs, and secrets. She learned the names of every servant, from Thornton, the ancient butler, to the youngest scullery maid who blushed crimson whenever addressed directly. She discovered the logic behind the manor's labyrinthine corridors, which had seemed designed to confuse, but were in fact organized around a central axis that, once understood, made navigation almost intuitive. She mapped the gardens in her mind, the formal rose gardens to the south, the wild meadows to the east, the ancient forest to the north that stretched for miles across moorland that belonged entirely to the Blackthorn estate. And she learned her husband. Julian was a contradiction wrapped in enigma, bound with threads of darkness and unexpected light. He rose before dawn each morning to ride across his lands, returning windswept and vital with color in his cheeks that made him look almost boyish. He spent hours in his study attending to correspondence and business matters that seemed to span continents. She caught glimpses of letters bearing stamps from India, America, the Far East, suggesting commercial interests far vaster than she had imagined. He took dinner with her every evening without fail, and those meals became something she anticipated with an eagerness that troubled her. Because Julian at dinner was a different creature than the Iron Duke of legend. He laughed at her observations about the household staff's elaborate hierarchy of grudges and alliances. He debated literature with her, revealing a passionate preference for Gothic novels that seemed almost too perfect given his circumstances. He asked her opinion on matters of estate management and actually listened to her answers, implementing her suggestions about the tenant cottage's needed repairs without condescension or dismissal. But there were moments when the mask slipped back into place. She saw it first when a letter arrived, bearing the seal of a Lord Ashworth, a name that made Julian's expression freeze into something terrifying. He read the contents in silence, and when he looked up, his eyes were the eyes of the monster she had been promised. Cold, calculating, utterly without mercy. "Forgive me," he said, his voice clipped and unfamiliar. "I have business that requires my immediate attention. I may be absent for several days." He left within the hour, and Ilara watched his carriage disappear down the drive with a chill that had nothing to do with the spring wind. He returned 4 days later, exhausted and grim, and would not speak of where he had been or what he had done. But within a week, she overheard 2 maids discussing the shocking news that Lord Ashworth had fled England entirely, his finances in ruins, his reputation destroyed by revelations of fraud and worse that had somehow found their way to every newspaper in London. Julian never mentioned it, but Ilara remembered the letter, the frozen expression, the 4-day absence, and understood that the monster was not fiction. He simply slept most of the time, waking only when provoked. She should have been afraid. Perhaps she was. But fear had become complicated, tangled up with other emotions she was not ready to name. 6 weeks into their marriage, Ilara discovered the locked room. She had been exploring the East Wing, which contained galleries of artwork and curiosities collected by generations of blackthorns, when she found a door that would not yield to her touch. It was unremarkable in appearance, plain oak, no different from dozens of others throughout the manor, but something about its resistance made her pause. "That room is kept locked, Your Grace," Mary said when Ilara inquired. Her maid's expression was carefully neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "His Grace's orders." "What is inside?" "I cannot say, Your Grace. None of the staff have ever been permitted entry." Curiosity burned in Ilara's chest, but she let the matter rest. She had learned that pushing too hard, too fast, only made Julian retreat behind his walls. Better to wait, to watch, to let understanding come in its own time. But she did not forget the locked door, and she noticed that Julian occasionally disappeared down the East Wing corridor, alone, returning hours later with shadows in his eyes that had nothing to do with business or strategy. Spring softened into early summer, and with the warming weather came an invitation that threw the household into chaos. "A ball," Julian said, his tone suggesting he had been invited to his own execution. "Lady Pemberton is hosting her annual summer ball, and she has specifically requested our attendance. Both of us." They sat in the small dining room that had become their evening sanctuary, candles casting warm light across the remains of an excellent meal. Ilara watched her husband's jaw tighten with what appeared to be genuine distress. "You do not wish to attend?" "I have not attended a society function in over 3 years. My presence tends to dampen the festivities. People forget how to dance when they are busy worrying that I might destroy their families over an imagined slight." Despite the grimness of his words, Ilara felt a smile tugging at her lips. How tragic for you. The most powerful man in England, forced to miss parties because everyone is too terrified to enjoy themselves. Julian's eyes narrowed, but she caught the glint of reluctant amusement. "You find my social isolation entertaining? I find it absurd. You have spent years cultivating a reputation so fearsome that you have essentially imprisoned yourself. Now you have a wife, a duchess who will be expected to participate in society, and you must choose between maintaining your monstrous image or actually living something resembling a normal life. There is a third option. We could simply decline." "We could." Ilara took a deliberate sip of her wine. "But I have not danced in over a year, and I am told the Pemberton balls feature an exceptional orchestra. It seems a shame to waste the opportunity." Julian stared at her as though she had suggested they fly to the moon. "You want to attend, knowing that every eye will be upon us, every whisper will concern us, every speculation will question what unholy arrangement brought us together." "I want to dance," she said simply. "I want to wear a beautiful gown and drink champagne and pretend for one evening that my life is not a series of obligations and accommodations. I want to see you in a ballroom, Julian. I want to know if the man who debates Gothic literature with me over dinner is capable of waltzing without terrifying his partner." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or that vulnerability she had glimpsed on their wedding night. "You would enter society on my arm? Publicly claim your place as my wife? There will be consequences. People will assume things about you. They will wonder what darkness you must possess to have willingly bound yourself to me. They will wonder regardless. At least this way I control the narrative. The mysterious new Duchess of Blackthorn, who walks without fear beside the Iron Duke. That is a story worth telling." Julian was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not the sharp-edged expression he wore as armor, but something softer, wondering. "You continue to astonish me. I intend to make a habit of it." He laughed, and the sound warmed something in her chest that had been cold for far too long. "Very well. We will attend the Pemberton ball, but I warn you, Ilara, I am an excellent dancer. My mother insisted I learn properly, and I have not forgotten. If you cannot keep pace, the failure will be entirely your own." "Is that a challenge, Your Grace?" "Consider it a promise." The preparations for the ball consumed the household for weeks. Seamstresses arrived from London bearing fabrics and patterns, and Ilara spent hours being measured and fitted and consulted about preferences she had never before been invited to express. Julian had made clear that expense was no object. She was to have whatever she wanted, the finest of everything, a gown that would establish her as a woman of consequence in her own right. She chose emerald silk, a color that made her grey-green eyes luminous and her chestnut hair glow with copper highlights. The design was elegant rather than ostentatious, classic lines that whispered of confidence rather than desperate display. She refused the elaborate jewels Julian offered from the Blackthorn collection, selecting instead a simple strand of pearls that had belonged to her mother, a reminder of who she had been before she became a duchess. When she descended the staircase on the evening of the ball, Julian stood in the entrance hall waiting for her. He was dressed in formal black and white, his dark hair brushed back from his face, his eyes reflecting the candlelight like pools of ink. He looked dangerous and elegant, and so devastatingly handsome that Ilara's breath caught in her throat. His reaction to her was equally gratifying. He went utterly still as she descended, his gaze traveling over her with an intensity that made her skin warm. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, he extended his hand without speaking, and she placed her fingers in his. "You are—" He stopped, seemed to struggle for words that did not come easily. "I have never seen anything more beautiful." "Flattery, Your Grace?" "Truth." His voice was rough, almost harsh. "I find myself entirely incapable of flattery where you are concerned. You strip away my ability to dissemble. It is profoundly inconvenient." Ilara smiled, feeling a surge of power she had never experienced before. This man, this feared, formidable, impossible man, was undone by the sight of her in an emerald gown. Whatever else their marriage might be, she was not without influence. "Then we should leave," she said, "before you recover your composure and remember how to be intimidating." The carriage ride to Pemberton House took an hour, during which Julian briefed her on the attendees she might encounter. Alliances and enmities, old scandals and current intrigues, the complex web of relationships that made up aristocratic society. He spoke of these people with detached precision, describing their weaknesses and motivations as though cataloguing specimens in a collection. It should have been unsettling. Instead, Ilara found herself grateful for the intelligence, understanding that knowledge was protection in the world she was about to enter. "And Lady Pemberton herself?" she asked, as the carriage began to slow. "A force of nature. She has been hosting these balls for 40 years and has become something of an institution. She fears nothing and no one, including me. She was a friend of my mother's, which is the only reason I received an invitation despite my years of absence." Julian's expression softened slightly. "She will want to inspect you, to determine whether you are worthy of the Blackthorn name. Be yourself, Ilara. That is the only way to earn her respect." "And if I fail to earn it?" "Then she will make your life in society extremely difficult." He met her eyes with absolute seriousness. "But you will not fail. I have seen you charm hostile servants, negotiate with stubborn tradesmen, and handle me at my most difficult without losing your composure. Lady Pemberton is formidable, but so are you." Before she could respond, the carriage stopped. Footmen rushed to open doors and lower steps, and suddenly they were stepping out into a blaze of torchlight and the murmur of gathered crowds. The whispers began immediately. "Blackthorne, that's Blackthorne. The Duchess. His new wife. What do you suppose she did to deserve?" Never thought he would show his face. Ilara felt Julian stiffen beside her, felt the walls rise around him as he prepared to face the fear and speculation. Without thinking, she tightened her grip on his arm and pressed closer to his side. "Together," she murmured, too low for anyone but him to hear. "Remember?" He looked down at her, and something in his expression cracked. Gratitude, wonder, a fierce tenderness that stole her breath. Together. They climbed the steps to Pemberton House, and the crowds parted before them like the Red Sea before Moses. Ilara kept her chin high and her expression serene, meeting curious gazes with polite acknowledgement rather than defensive hostility. She was the Duchess of Blackthorne. She belonged here. She would not apologize for her presence or cower before speculation. The ballroom was magnificent, a vast space of white and gold, glittering with thousands of candles reflected in countless mirrors. An orchestra played from a raised platform, and couples swirled across the dance floor in elaborate patterns. But as Julian and Ilara entered, the music faltered, and dancers stumbled to uncertain halts. "Bloody hell," Julian muttered. "I told you this would happen." "Smile," Ilara commanded. "Look as though you are delighted to be here and cannot imagine why anyone would think otherwise." "I am not delighted. I am profoundly uncomfortable." "Then act. You have spent 20 years playing a role. Surely you can manage a pleasant expression for one evening?" The look he gave her was half exasperated, half admiring, but he smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine, and offered his arm to lead her further into the ballroom. The effect was remarkable. That smile, directed at her with obvious affection, transformed the Iron Duke into something approaching human. Whispers shifted in tone from fearful speculation to surprised curiosity. If the monster could smile like that at his wife, perhaps he was not entirely beyond redemption. Lady Pemberton descended upon them like a ship in full sail, her silver hair elaborately styled, her considerable bosom draped in diamonds. She was perhaps 70, with the sharp eyes of a woman who had seen everything and was no longer capable of being shocked. "Julian Thorne," her voice carried despite the resumed music, "you have finally deigned to grace us with your presence. I was beginning to think you had become a vampire, incapable of venturing forth except in darkness. Lady Pemberton." Julian bowed over her hand with perfect courtesy. "You know I could never refuse your invitations indefinitely. Your disappointment would haunt me. Flatterer. You refused for 3 years without apparent distress." Her gaze shifted to Ilara, sharp and assessing. "And this is the bride, the mysterious Miss Whitmore, who somehow captured the uncapturable Duke." "Ilara Thorne now," Ilara replied, dropping into a curtsy. "And I assure you, Lady Pemberton, the capture was entirely mutual." Lady Pemberton's eyebrows rose. "Was it indeed?" She circled Ilara like a hawk examining potential prey, taking in every detail of her gown, her posture, her expression. "You do not seem frightened of him." "Should I be? Most people are." "I have found," Ilara said carefully, "that my husband is considerably more complicated than his reputation suggests. Frightening in some respects, certainly, but also kind, intelligent, and surprisingly good company. I count myself fortunate." The older woman stared at her for a long moment, then let out a bark of laughter that turned heads across the ballroom. "Good God! Julian, wherever did you find this creature? She is magnificent." "I am aware." Julian's voice was warm with pride that made Ilara's cheeks flush. "You will do," Lady Pemberton declared, addressing Ilara. "You will more than do. The Blackthorne name has needed someone with spine for generations. Finally, we have a duchess worthy of the title." She reached out and patted Ilara's cheek with surprising gentleness. "Welcome to society, my dear. It is a viper's nest of jealousy and intrigue, but I suspect you will navigate it admirably, and if anyone gives you trouble—" She shot a meaningful glance at Julian. "I imagine your husband will handle matters appropriately." "I certainly will," Julian agreed, and there was something in his tone that reminded everyone within earshot exactly who he was and what he was capable of. With Lady Pemberton's blessing secured, the evening transformed. People who had been maintaining careful distance suddenly found reasons to approach. Tentative at first, then with increasing confidence as Ilara proved herself charming and Julian proved himself capable of civil conversation. The music played, champagne flowed, and Ilara felt the intoxication of social triumph mixing with the actual champagne to produce a giddy lightness she had not experienced in years. "You are enjoying yourself," Julian observed during a momentary lull. "I am. Is that so surprising?" "Frankly, yes. I expected you to endure this as a necessary evil, not to bloom like a flower in sunlight." Ilara laughed, a free, genuine laugh that drew approving glances from nearby matrons. "Perhaps I am more adaptable than either of us expected. Or perhaps I simply enjoy proving everyone wrong. They came here expecting to see a frightened victim on the arm of a monster. Instead, they see a partnership. It is immensely satisfying." "A partnership?" Julian repeated the word as though tasting it. "Is that what we are? Is that not what you wanted?" His eyes darkened with something that made her pulse quicken. "I want many things where you are concerned, Ilara." "Partnership is only the beginning." Before she could respond, the orchestra struck up a waltz, the dance she had been anticipating all evening. Julian extended his hand, his expression a challenge. "My promise, if you recall." She placed her hand in his. "I recall." He led her onto the dance floor, and the crowds parted once again, this time with a different energy, anticipation rather than fear. The Duke of Blackthorn was about to dance with his Duchess. Society had not witnessed such a spectacle in years. Julian drew her into the proper position, his hand warm against her waist, his fingers intertwined with hers. The music swelled, and they began to move. He had not lied about his abilities. Julian danced with the same controlled grace he brought to everything, precise, powerful, utterly commanding, but there was more than technique in the way he moved her across the floor. There was something almost reverent in his touch, a tenderness that belied the force of his reputation. "You are staring," Ilara murmured as they swept through a turn. "You are worth staring at. People will talk. Let them." His arm tightened around her waist, drawing her imperceptibly closer. "Let them see exactly what I have found. Let them understand that the monster has discovered something precious, something worth protecting, something that makes every dark moment of his existence worthwhile." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. The heat of his body, the intensity of his gaze, the music swirling around them. It was too much, overwhelming, impossible to resist. "Julian, I know I promised to make no demands," he continued, his voice low and urgent. "I know I said I would wait until you came to me freely. But you should know, Ilara, you should understand that waiting is the hardest thing I have ever done. Every evening when I leave you at your door, it takes every fragment of my will not to follow you inside. Every morning when I ride out before dawn, it is because lying awake knowing you are just through that connecting door is a torture I cannot endure. You never said, 'How could I? You did not choose this marriage. You did not choose me.' To burden you with my feelings when you are still learning to tolerate my presence seemed unfair beyond measure." His jaw tightened. "But tonight, seeing you shine in that ballroom, watching you conquer society with your grace and wit and absolute fearlessness, I find I cannot keep silent any longer. I am falling in love with you, Ilara. Perhaps I have been falling since I saw you at that window years ago. And I need you to know, even if you never feel the same, even if all you ever give me is tolerance and partnership, I need you to know that you have changed everything. You have made me want to be better, to be worthy, to be the man you deserve instead of the monster I became." The music reached its crescendo and slowed, the dance ending. They stood in the center of the ballroom, still holding each other, oblivious to the hundreds of eyes upon them. "Say something," Julian breathed. please." Ilara looked up at the man who had purchased her like property, who had confessed his loneliness and his longing, who had shown her kindness when she expected cruelty and vulnerability when she expected strength. The man who had just declared his love in the middle of a crowded ballroom, risking everything for a moment of honesty. "Take me home," she whispered. His expression flickered, hope and fear warring behind his eyes. "Ilara, take me home, Julian. I find I am done with society for this evening. I have other matters to attend to." Understanding dawned, and with it, a joy so fierce it transformed his features entirely. They departed Pemberton House with considerably less ceremony than they had arrived, brief farewells to Lady Pemberton, who watched them go with knowing amusement, and then they were in the carriage, and Julian was pulling her into his arms, and his mouth was on hers, and nothing else mattered. The kiss was everything she had not allowed herself to imagine. Passionate, demanding, tender all at once. His hands cradled her face as though she was something precious and fragile, but his lips moved against hers with a hunger that spoke of months of restraint, finally shattered. Ilara kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring into the embrace all the confusion and longing and unexpected affection that had been building since she first entered his library and found a man instead of a monster. "I have wanted this," Julian gasped against her mouth, "since the moment I saw you, wanted you, dreamed of you, tortured myself with imaginings that could never capture the reality of holding you." "Stop talking," Ilara commanded, and pulled him back to her. The carriage ride home passed in a blur of sensation, his hands in her hair, her fingers gripping his shoulders, the heat of him against her, despite the layers of formal clothing that suddenly seemed impossibly frustrating. By the time they reached Blackthorn Manor, they were both disheveled and breathless and beyond caring what the servants might think. Julian lifted her from the carriage and carried her through the entrance hall, past a studiously impassive Thornton, up the grand staircase to the family wing. But he did not take her to her chambers. Instead, he pushed open the door to his own rooms, a space she had never entered, and set her gently on her feet in the center of a room dominated by a massive four-poster bed. "If you have changed your mind," he said, his voice strained with the effort of restraint, "if you need more time, if this is too fast." Ilara answered by reaching behind herself and beginning to unfasten her gown. What followed was a revelation, not merely of bodies, but of souls. Julian made love with the same intensity he brought to everything, but there was reverence beneath the passion, a constant awareness of her pleasure that transformed the act from obligation into communion. He learned her slowly, thoroughly, drawing responses from her that she had not known herself capable of. And when at last they lay tangled together in the aftermath, sweat damp and satiated, Ilara felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of her own life. She had expected to endure this marriage. She had hoped at best for tolerance and respect. She had not expected to find herself falling in love with her husband. The weeks that followed were the happiest Ilara had ever known. Julian, freed from the constraints of his self-imposed restraint, proved to be an attentive and generous lover who delighted in exploring the depths of their physical connection. But it was not merely the nights that transformed, it was everything. They rode together across the moors, racing until their horses were lathered, and they were both laughing breathlessly. They debated books in the library until candles guttered, agreeing on enough to provide foundation and disagreeing on enough to keep things interesting. They took meals together not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire for each other's company. Julian began including her in matters of estate business, seeking her opinion on decisions that would have been considered entirely masculine domains. And slowly, carefully, he began to reveal more of himself. She learned of his childhood, the distant father who had seen his heir as an extension of his own ambitions, the gentle mother who had died too young, the brother whose loss still carved visible pain across Julian's features when he spoke of it. She learned of the years after his parents' deaths, when he had been forced to become hard and ruthless, simply to survive the predators who circled a young duke's wealth. She learned of the choices that had haunted him, the moments when he had chosen strategy over mercy, and wondered afterward if there had been another path. "You judge yourself too harshly," she told him one evening as they sat before the fire in his study. She had taken to spending her evenings here rather than in her own sitting room, drawn by his presence like a moth to flame. The men you destroyed, they were trying to steal your birthright. They were not innocents. No, but their families were. Their children who lost everything because of their father's greed and my retribution. Julian stared into the flames. I tell myself it was necessary. That showing weakness would have invited more attacks, that making an example was the only way to ensure safety. But I wonder sometimes if I simply enjoyed the power, if the boy who lost everything found pleasure in taking everything from others. Perhaps both things are true. Ilara moved closer to him, resting her head against his shoulder. Perhaps you were strategic and vengeful, simultaneously. Perhaps the boy who was hurt wanted to hurt others, and the young duke who needed to survive found a way to channel that pain into protection. That does not make you a monster, Julian. It makes you human. His arm came around her, pulling her closer. You see me too clearly. Is that not what you wanted? I wanted it more than I can express. I simply did not expect it to be so uncomfortable. He pressed a kiss to her hair. You make me want to be better than I am. Every day, every moment I find myself thinking of how you would judge my choices. It is profoundly inconvenient. Good. A conscience is meant to be inconvenient. She tilted her face up to look at him. Julian, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. His expression grew wary. Ask. The locked room in the east wing. What is inside? Silence stretched between them, heavy with tension. Ilara felt Julian's arm tighten around her, saw the walls rise behind his eyes. That room, he said finally, contains the one part of my past I have not yet found the courage to share with you. It is not dangerous, Ilara. It is not evidence of crimes or secrets that would change your opinion of me. At least I hope not. But it is painful, deeply, personally painful, and I'm not certain I am ready to open that door. Will you ever be ready? I do not know. His voice was rough. I want to share everything with you. I want there to be no secrets between us, but some wounds are so old, so deep, that exposing them feels like dying. I have locked that room for 15 years. The thought of unlocking it now. Ilara reached up to touch his face, turning him to meet her eyes. When you are ready, I will be there. I will not push, I will not demand, but I want you to know that whatever is behind that door, whatever pain it represents, it will not change what I feel for you. Nothing could change that now. What you feel for me? His voice was barely a whisper. Ilara. She had not said the words yet. Neither of them had, not since his declaration at the ball. It had seemed too enormous, too frightening, too likely to shatter if examined too closely. But looking at him now, seeing the hope and fear warring in his eyes, she knew she could not wait any longer. I love you, she said simply. I did not want to. I did not expect to. But I love you, Julian Thorne, Duke of Blackthorn, monster and man and everything in between. I love you. He kissed her then, fierce and desperate, and she tasted salt on his lips and realized he was weeping. The Iron Duke, the man who never showed weakness, was crying in her arms. I do not deserve you, he said against her mouth. I will never deserve you. Probably not. She smiled through her own tears. But you have me nonetheless. For better or worse, remember, those vows apply to both of us. They made love there before the fire, slow and tender, a physical affirmation of the emotional bond that had grown between them. And afterward, as they lay entwined on the carpet with the flames casting dancing shadows across their skin, Julian made a decision. Tomorrow, he said quietly, tomorrow I will show you the room. I will tell you everything. You deserve to know who I truly am, all of it, not just the parts I have chosen to share. Only if you are ready. I will never be ready. He met her eyes with raw honesty. But I love you too much to keep hiding. Whatever comes next, we face it together. The next morning dawned grey and uncertain, matching Ilara's mood as she followed Julian down the East Wing corridor. He had been silent through breakfast, his expression shuttered in a way she had not seen since their early days. Whatever waited behind the locked door, it was costing him dearly to approach it. They stopped before the unremarkable oak door, and Julian produced a key from his pocket. Old iron, worn smooth by years of handling, despite its apparent disuse. "The room belonged to my brother," he said, his voice flat. "Thomas. He was 3 years younger than me, and he was everything I was not. Warm where I was cold, trusting where I was suspicious. He believed the best of everyone, even when they proved him wrong again and again. Our father called him weak, I called him hopeful. I have never been certain which of us was right." The key turned in the lock with a click that seemed too loud in the silent corridor. "He died 15 years ago. A riding accident," they said. "His horse threw him and he broke his neck. Quick and clean, at least. He did not suffer." Julian's hand rested on the door handle but did not turn it. "Except it was not an accident. I discovered later, too late, that his horse had been deliberately spooked. Someone had arranged the entire thing. Someone had murdered my brother and made it look like misfortune." Ilara's hand found his, squeezing tightly. "Julian, I found the men responsible. It took me 2 years, but I found them. They were business rivals who believed that removing Thomas would destabilize me, make me vulnerable, give them an opportunity to move against our interests." His laugh was bitter, broken. "They were wrong. Losing Thomas did not make me vulnerable. It made me into the monster everyone fears. Every ruthless thing I have done since, every destroyed enemy, every reputation ruined and family shattered. It all began with his death, with my need to ensure that no one would ever dare strike at me again." He pushed open the door. The room beyond was a shrine. Thomas Thorne stared out from a dozen portraits, a young man with Julian's dark coloring, but an entirely different expression, open and warm, and impossibly young. His belongings filled the space, books he had been reading, clothes he had been wearing, a half-finished letter on a desk that had not been touched in 15 years. Dust covered everything, undisturbed except for a clear path to a chair that faced the largest portrait. "I come here sometimes," Julian said, his voice barely audible, "to remember him, to apologize for failing him, to ask forgiveness for becoming the thing he would have hated." Ilara moved through the room slowly, taking in the evidence of a life cut short. Thomas had been perhaps 20 when he died, young enough to believe the world was good, old enough to have developed interests and passions and dreams. His books were philosophy and poetry. His letters, from what she could see, spoke of travel plans and social engagements, and a young woman named Elizabeth, who appeared frequently in his correspondence. Who was Elizabeth? His fiancée. They were to be married that summer. Julian sank into the chair before Thomas's portrait, looking up at his brother's painted face. "She married someone else eventually. I do not blame her. She could not wait forever for a dead man." Ilara knelt beside the chair, taking Julian's hands in hers. "You have carried this alone for 15 years. I could not share it, not with anyone. To speak of Thomas was to feel his loss all over again. To explain what happened was to admit that I had failed him, that my reputation for ruthlessness came too late to save my brother, the only person in the world who loved me without condition or fear. He would not want this." Ilara gestured at the preserved room, the shrine to guilt and grief. "He would not want you to torture yourself indefinitely. From everything you have described, Thomas sounds like someone who would want you to live, to find happiness, to stop punishing yourself for a crime you did not commit. I should have seen it coming. I should have protected him. You were 23 years old, grieving your parents, trying to hold together a legacy that others were desperate to steal. You could not have predicted murder. No one could have predicted murder. The men who did it, when I destroyed them, I felt nothing but satisfaction. I watched their lives crumble and I was glad. I wanted them to suffer as I had suffered, to lose everything as I had lost everything. And they did. They lost everything." Julian's voice cracked. "But it did not bring Thomas back. It did not undo the loss. It only transformed me into someone he would not recognize, or someone who loved him enough to demand justice." Ilara reached up to cup his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Grief takes many forms, Julian. Yours took the form of righteous fury. Perhaps that fury went too far, lasted too long, consumed too much of who you were. But at its heart was love. The love of a brother who could not save Thomas, but could ensure that his death did not go unanswered. You see good in me, where I see only darkness. Perhaps we are both right. Perhaps you are dark and light together, capable of great cruelty and great love. Perhaps all of us are. She leaned forward and pressed a kiss to his forehead. You have shown me your deepest wound, Julian. You have trusted me with the memory of Thomas and the guilt that has haunted you. Now let me help you heal, not by forgetting him, but by living the kind of life that would have made him proud. For a long moment, Julian simply looked at her. This woman who had entered his life through coercion and somehow become its center, who saw past his defenses to the broken man beneath and loved him anyway. How? He asked finally. How do I become someone Thomas would be proud of? Ilara smiled, feeling the weight of his trust settle into her heart like a precious burden she would carry gladly for the rest of her life. Together, she said, we figure it out together. The summer deepened into a golden haze of happiness that Ilara had never dared imagine. Blackthorn Manor, once a fortress of shadows and secrets, had transformed into a home, filled with laughter and warmth and the quiet joy of two people discovering each other anew each day. The locked room in the east wing remained, but it was no longer a shrine to guilt. Julian visited sometimes, speaking to his brother's portrait of Ilara, of their life together, of the man he was trying to become. And when he emerged, his eyes were often red, but his spirit was lighter, as though the ghost of Thomas Thorne had finally found peace enough to release his brother from the prison of grief. The household staff, initially wary of the change in their master's demeanor, had gradually relaxed into something approaching contentment. Cook prepared elaborate meals designed to showcase her skills, knowing the Duke and Duchess would actually appreciate them now, rather than picking at food in distracted silence. The gardeners competed to produce the most spectacular blooms for the Duchess's favorite rooms. Even Thornton, that monument to impassive servitude, had been caught smiling at the sound of Julian's laughter echoing through the halls. Society, too, had adjusted its expectations. Word had spread from the Pemberton ball that the Duke of Blackthorn was not quite the monster of legend, or rather, that his monstrous tendencies seemed entirely reserved for those who threatened his interests, rather than those who merely existed in his vicinity. Invitations arrived at Blackthorn Manor with increasing frequency, and Ilara found herself navigating a social calendar that would have overwhelmed her a year ago. Julian accompanied her when business permitted, and his presence at events had shifted from a source of terror to a source of fascination. The Tun loved nothing more than a reformed villain, and the narrative of the Iron Duke, transformed by love, proved irresistible. But happiness, Ilara would learn, has a way of making one forget that the world contains forces opposed to joy. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August, delivered by private courier rather than the regular post. Julian had risen early for a meeting with his estate manager, leaving Ilara to enjoy a leisurely breakfast in the morning room. She was reading correspondence from her sisters, Margaret breathless with news of her first serious suitor, Catherine still young enough to focus on her studies rather than matrimonial prospects, when Thornton appeared with a silver tray. "This arrived for His Grace, Your Grace." The courier indicated it was urgent. Ilara glanced at the letter. Heavy cream paper, sealed with red wax bearing an unfamiliar crest. "His Grace is occupied with Mr. Harrison. I will ensure he receives it immediately upon finishing." Thornton hesitated. An extraordinary occurrence for a man who never hesitated. "The courier was most insistent, Your Grace. He said the matter could not wait." Something cold brushed against Ilara's spine, the animal instinct that warns of approaching storms. "Send a footman to interrupt the meeting. Tell His Grace there is an urgent communication requiring his immediate attention." Julian appeared within minutes, his expression already sharpening into the focused intensity she recognized from his business dealings. He took the letter, examined the seal, and his face went absolutely still. "Leave us," he said to Thornton. His voice was calm, controlled, and utterly terrifying. When they were alone, Ilara rose from her chair. "Julian, what is it?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. his eyes scanning the contents with a speed born of years of processing critical information. She watched his expression shift, disbelief first, then cold fury, then something that looked almost like fear. Julian. He looked up at her, and for a moment he was the man she had first met in the library, the Iron Duke, armored against all emotion, prepared for battle. "Lord Ashworth," he said flatly, "the man whose schemes I dismantled earlier this year. It appears he did not flee to the continent as I believed. He has been in hiding, gathering evidence, building a case." Julian's laugh was bitter. "He intends to bring charges against me. Fraud, conspiracy, the manipulation of markets and men. He claims to have documentation that will prove I have broken dozens of laws in my pursuit of power." Ilara's blood ran cold. "Can he? Is there evidence?" "Of course there is evidence." Julian threw the letter onto the table. "I have spent 20 years doing whatever was necessary to protect my interests and destroy my enemies. I have bribed officials, manipulated information, ruined men through means that were technically illegal if never proven. Ashworth knows where the bodies are buried because he was once part of that world himself. If he has found the right documents, spoken to the right people, then what? Then I face prosecution, imprisonment, the seizure of the Blackthorn assets, disgrace." His voice hardened. "And you would be tainted by association, the wife of a convicted criminal. Society would turn its back. Your family would suffer the consequences of my sins." "I do not care about society." "You should." He turned to her, and she saw the fear now, naked and overwhelming. "Ilara, you need to understand what this means. If Ashworth succeeds, everything we have built, everything, will be destroyed. I can fight him. I will fight him. But the battle will be ugly, and the outcome is far from certain. You should think about what you want to do." The implication hit her like a physical blow. "You are suggesting I leave you." "I am suggesting you have options. Our marriage was arranged, coerced. Given the circumstances under which it began, you would have grounds for annulment if you chose to pursue it. Your reputation might be salvaged. Your future—" "Stop." Ilara crossed the distance between them and took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Stop, Julian. Do you really think so little of me? Do you imagine I married you only for the pleasant times, that I would flee at the first sign of difficulty? This is not difficulty. This is catastrophe. Then we face catastrophe together. For better or worse, remember, those vows were not conditional on your continued fortune and reputation." She softened her voice, but not her grip. "I love you. I love you when you are charming at dinner parties and when you are terrifying in business negotiations. I love you when you weep for your brother and when you plot against your enemies. I will not abandon you now, Julian. I refuse." Something cracked in his expression, the armor falling away, revealing the vulnerable man beneath. "Ilara, tell me what we do. Tell me how we fight this. I am your partner, your wife, your ally in all things. Use me." For a long moment, he simply held her, his face buried in her hair, his powerful body trembling with emotions he had spent a lifetime learning to suppress. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were wet, but his jaw was set with determination. "We fight," he said. "We fight with everything we have, and we do it together." The weeks that followed were unlike anything Ilara had experienced. The manor transformed into a war room, with Julian's most trusted solicitors and investigators taking up residence in the guest wing. Documents were examined, witnesses interviewed, strategies debated late into the night. Ilara threw herself into the effort, organizing information, managing the household despite the chaos, ensuring that Julian ate and slept even when he was consumed by the battle. Ashworth, it emerged, had been meticulous. His documentation of Julian's activities over the past 2 decades was comprehensive enough to pose a genuine threat. He had found disgruntled former associates willing to testify, uncovered financial records that had been thought safely destroyed, traced connections that should have been untraceable. Whatever his other failings, the man was intelligent and motivated by a hatred that had transformed into obsession during his months of hiding. But Julian was not without resources of his own. His network of contacts and informants, built over 20 years of strategic maneuvering, began to yield intelligence about Ashworth's weaknesses. The man had made his own enemies, committed his own crimes, left his own trail of evidence. If the battle was to be fought with information, Julian intended to be better armed than his opponent. "He is not merely seeking legal victory," Julian said one evening, spreading documents across the desk in his study, while Ilara examined a ledger of Ashworth's financial dealings. "He wants destruction, public humiliation. He wants to watch me fall and know that he caused it." "Pride," Ilara observed. "You wounded his pride when you exposed him, and now he seeks revenge regardless of cost." "Yes, which makes him dangerous but also predictable. A rational man would negotiate, would seek settlement, would weigh the risks of continued conflict. Ashworth is beyond rationality. He will pursue this to the bitter end, whatever that end might be. Then we ensure the bitter end is his, not ours." Julian looked up at her, and despite the exhaustion and strain that had marked his features in recent weeks, he smiled. "Have I told you lately that I love you?" "Not in the past hour. I was beginning to feel neglected." He reached for her hand, drawing her around the desk and into his lap. "I love you. I love your courage and your wit, and your absolute refusal to be anything other than extraordinary. I do not deserve you, but I am unutterably grateful that you are mine." "Yours," she agreed, leaning into his embrace. "Whatever comes, always yours." They sat together in the candlelight, surrounded by the evidence of their enemies' machinations, and Ilara felt a fierce certainty settle into her bones. They would survive this. They would triumph, because they had something Ashworth, in his isolated obsession, could never understand. They had each other. The confrontation came on a cold October morning, with frost silvering the moors and a pale sun struggling to penetrate the clouds. Ashworth had finally emerged from hiding, confident in his evidence, ready to press forward with his accusations. He had demanded a meeting, claiming he wished to offer Julian one final chance to surrender before the full weight of justice descended. Julian, of course, had other plans. They met at a neutral location, a private room in a London club that had hosted generations of aristocratic negotiations and duels. Julian arrived with his solicitor and Ilara at his side, despite her husband's protests that she should remain safely at home. "I will not cower in the country while you fight my battles," she had told him, her voice brooking no argument. "We face this together or not at all." Ashworth was already waiting when they entered, a lean man with silver hair and eyes that burned with cold fire. He had been handsome once, Ilara supposed, but hatred had carved harsh lines into his features, aging him beyond his years. He looked at Julian with undisguised loathing, then shifted his attention to Ilara with something that might have been curiosity or contempt. "The Duchess," he said, his voice mocking. "I wondered if you would bring her. Tell me, Your Grace, does she know what manner of man she married? Does she understand the depths of his corruption? I understand that you attempted to defraud his family's interests and faced consequences for your crimes," Ilara replied coolly. "I understand that rather than accepting responsibility for your actions, you chose to pursue vendetta against the man who exposed you. That tells me everything I need to know about your character, Lord Ashworth." Ashworth's expression flickered, surprise that she would speak, anger that she would challenge him. "You have been fed lies. Your husband is a master of manipulation. He has bent you to his will as he bends everyone, and you do not even realize you are his puppet." "Enough!" Julian's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You requested this meeting to discuss terms, Ashworth. I suggest you do so before my patience exhausts itself." "Terms?" Ashworth laughed bitterly. "Very well, here are my terms. You will sign a full confession of your crimes against me and others. You will surrender your assets to compensate those you have wronged. You will accept exile from England, permanent and irrevocable. In exchange, I will not pursue criminal prosecution. You will avoid prison if nothing else. And if I refuse, Then I will destroy you, every document I have gathered, every witness I have cultivated, every piece of evidence that demonstrates the true nature of your activities. All of it will be presented to the authorities and the press. Your reputation will be annihilated. Your fortune will be seized. Your wife—" His eyes found Ilara again, gleaming with malice. "Will find herself married to a disgraced convict, assuming the marriage survives at all." Julian was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio. "I have a counteroffer." He opened the portfolio and spread its contents across the table: documents, letters, financial records, sworn statements. Ashworth's face went pale as he recognized what he was seeing. "You believed you were the only one capable of investigation," Julian said, his voice soft and dangerous. "You forgot that I have spent 20 years building a network that spans continents. Your crimes, Ashworth, are rather more extensive than mine. Embezzlement from your own investors, bribery of government officials, the manipulation of markets for personal gain. Ironic, given your accusations against me, and most damning of all." He tapped a particular document. "Evidence linking you to the death of one Frederick Marlowe, who threatened to expose your schemes 3 years ago. That is a lie, is it? I have witnesses. I have financial records showing payments to the men who arranged his accident. I have a sworn statement from one of those men who proved remarkably cooperative once he understood the alternative." Julian's smile was sharp as a knife's edge. "You came here threatening to destroy me, Ashworth. You should have remembered that destruction is a game I have played far longer than you." Ashworth stared at the documents, his face cycling through rage, fear, and finally a desperate calculation. "What do you want?" "I want you to disappear. Genuinely this time, not lurking in shadows, plotting revenge. You will leave England. You will never return. You will never speak my name again or take any action against me or my family. In exchange, I will not hand these documents to the authorities, who would very much like to solve the mystery of Frederick Marlowe's death. You cannot simply—" "I can. I am." Julian gathered the documents and returned them to the portfolio. "You have 24 hours to make your decision. Accept my terms and you walk away with your life and freedom. Refuse, and I will ensure that you spend what remains of your years in a cell, contemplating the consequences of your own hubris." He rose, offering his arm to Ilara. "We are finished here." They were almost to the door when Ashworth spoke again, his voice shaking with impotent fury. "This is not over, Blackthorn. You cannot silence me forever. One day, one way or another, the truth will emerge. And when it does—" Julian turned and Ilara saw the full force of the Iron Duke in his expression. Cold, merciless, absolute. "The truth, Ashworth, is that you attempted to destroy a man far more dangerous than yourself, and failed. The truth is that your hatred blinded you to the reality of your situation. The truth is that you lost this battle before it ever began because you forgot the first rule of warfare: never engage an enemy unless you are certain you can win." He smiled, and there was no warmth in it whatsoever. 24 hours. Choose wisely. They left Ashworth sitting amid the ruins of his schemes, his face ashen, his hands trembling. In the carriage home, Julian was silent for a long while, staring out the window at the grey London streets. "It is finished," Ilara said softly. "Yes." But his voice was heavy rather than triumphant. "I destroyed him, Ilara. Not merely defeated, destroyed. His evidence against me, his plans for revenge, his hope of justice, all of it, crushed. And I used methods no better than his own. I found his crimes and used them as weapons. I threatened him with prosecution for murder, while knowing my own hands are far from clean. He would have done the same to you. Yes, he would have. That is precisely my point." Julian turned to face her, and she saw the conflict raging behind his eyes. "I told you once that I was trying to be better, that you had made me want to be worthy of your love. But today I was exactly the monster I have always been. Strategic, ruthless, willing to use any means necessary to protect what is mine." Ilara reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. You were a man protecting his family. There is no shame in that. Is there not? I threatened a man with hanging for a crime I am not certain he committed. I used evidence that may have been obtained through bribery and coercion. You survived. Her voice was firm, cutting through his spiral of self-doubt. You protected me, protected our future, protected everything we have built together. Perhaps the methods were not noble, perhaps a better man would have found another way. But Julian, she squeezed his hand until he met her eyes. You are not trying to be a saint. You are trying to be human, and humans do what they must to protect those they love. You are not disappointed in me? I am proud of you. Proud of your brilliance, your determination, your willingness to fight for us even when the cost was dear. She leaned across the carriage to kiss him softly. I married the Duke of Blackthorn, Julian. I knew what that meant. I love you, all of you, including the parts that frighten lesser men. Never doubt that. Something in his expression eased, the tension draining from his shoulders. How did I ever survive before you? Poorly, I imagine. He laughed, genuine, surprised, warming, and pulled her into his arms. I love you, Elara Thorne, more than I ever imagined possible, more than I have words to express. Then show me, she murmured against his lips, when we are home. Show me exactly how much. The promise in his eyes made the long carriage ride home feel like an eternity. Ashworth fled to the continent within the week, his assets liquidated, his reputation destroyed by whispers that spread through society like wildfire. The official story was vague. Financial difficulties, health concerns, a need for warmer climates. But everyone understood the truth. The Duke of Blackthorn had been challenged, and the challenger had been annihilated. Julian's reputation, paradoxically, emerged from the crisis stronger than ever. He had been tested by a determined enemy and proven victorious. The Tun, always appreciative of power, found new reasons to respect and fear him. But alongside the fear, there was something else now. A grudging acknowledgement that the Iron Duke might be more than mere monster. He had a wife who adored him openly, a household that ran with warmth rather than terror, a presence at social events that suggested he might be capable of existing among ordinary humans after all. For her part, Elara found herself elevated to a status she had never anticipated. The Duchess who had stood beside her husband through crisis, who had accompanied him to the confrontation with his enemy, who had emerged with her head high and her loyalty unquestioned. She had become a figure of fascination in her own right. Young women sought her out for advice on managing difficult husbands. Older matrons nodded with approval at her composure under pressure. Even Lady Pemberton, that formidable arbiter of society, had declared publicly that the Duchess of Blackthorn was the finest woman to bear the title in 3 generations. But it was the private moments that mattered most. On a cold December evening, with snow falling softly outside the windows and a fire blazing in the hearth of Julian's study, Elara sat in her favorite chair reading while her husband worked at his desk. It was a scene of domestic tranquility so ordinary that it might have belonged to any happy couple, and yet, knowing what they had overcome to reach this moment, it felt like a miracle. I have been thinking, Julian said, breaking the comfortable silence. A dangerous pastime. Undoubtedly. He set down his pen and turned to face her. I have been thinking about the future, about what kind of life I want to build with you, what kind of man I want to become. Elara closed her book, giving him her full attention. And what conclusions have you reached? I want to step back from business. Not entirely. The Blackthorn interests are too vast to abandon completely, and there are people whose livelihoods depend on my continued management. But I want to delegate more, trust more, spend less time scheming and more time— He gestured at the room around them, at her, at the fire. Living. That sounds lovely. I want to be here with you. I want to ride across the moors and debate literature, and learn everything there is to know about the remarkable woman I married. I want to build something that will last beyond my lifetime. Not empires of commerce, but perhaps a family. Children who will know their father as something other than a distant figure consumed by power. Elara's heart stuttered. They had not discussed children. It had seemed too fragile a hope to speak aloud during the crisis, and afterward the subject had remained untouched, waiting for the right moment. "Children," she repeated softly, "if you want them. Only if you want them." Julian rose from his desk and crossed to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "I know our marriage began under circumstances that made such discussions impossible. I know I have no right to assume anything about your desires for the future, but I find myself hoping, desperately, foolishly hoping, that you might want to build a family with me, that you might trust me enough to bring children into a world I have spent 20 years making dangerous." Ilara looked at the man kneeling before her, this complicated, brilliant, damaged, magnificent man who had purchased her like property and then spent every moment since trying to earn her heart. The man who had confessed his loneliness and his sins, who had wept for his brother and fought for his wife, who was asking now for the chance to be something he had never believed possible, a father, a family man, human. "I want that," she whispered. "I want children with your eyes and your stubborn jaw. I want to watch you teach them to ride and argue with them about books. I want to build a family that proves, to you, to the world, to ourselves, that the Iron Duke can be more than his reputation." Julian's breath caught, and she saw the sheen of tears in his eyes. "Ilara." "I love you," she said, pulling him up to sit beside her in the chair that was really too small for two. "I love you, and I want everything with you, the good and the bad, the easy and the hard, the quiet evenings and the dangerous battles. All of it. Everything." He kissed her then, deep and tender and full of promise. The fire crackled, the snow fell, and outside the windows of Blackthorn Manor, the world continued on its way, unaware that within those ancient walls, two people had found something rare and precious and worth fighting for. Spring returned to Yorkshire with an explosion of colour that seemed designed specifically to celebrate the news Ilara carried. She told Julian on a morning in early April, when the gardens were rioting with daffodils and the air smelled of new beginnings. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for: joy, terror, overwhelming love, and a protective instinct so fierce it was almost comical. He refused to let her climb stairs unassisted. He ordered the cook to prepare only the most nourishing foods. He sent to London for the finest physician and to Paris for a midwife renowned throughout Europe. "You are being ridiculous," Ilara told him fondly, submitting to yet another attempt to wrap her in blankets despite the mild weather. "I am being careful. There is a difference." "There is not, actually." But she let him fuss, understanding that for a man who had lost everyone he loved, the prospect of new life was both miracle and terror. Julian needed to protect, to prepare, to control whatever variables he could. It was who he was, and she loved him for it even when it drove her to distraction. The pregnancy progressed without complication, much to everyone's relief. Ilara grew round and radiant, blooming with the life inside her. Julian grew increasingly anxious, unable to shake the fear that something would go wrong, that happiness of this magnitude must inevitably attract catastrophe. "Nothing bad is going to happen," she assured him repeatedly. "I am healthy. The baby is healthy, and we have the finest medical care available. Stop borrowing trouble." "I am not borrowing trouble. I am anticipating contingencies." "You are driving yourself mad for no reason." She was right, of course. The birth, when it came on a golden September afternoon, was relatively swift and uncomplicated. Julian paced the corridor outside their chambers like a caged tiger, forbidden from entering by the midwife, but unable to sit still. When the cry of a newborn finally pierced the air, he burst through the door despite all propriety, desperate to see his wife and child. Ilara lay against a pile of pillows, exhausted but glowing, a small bundle cradled against her chest. She looked up as Julian entered, and her smile was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Come meet your son," she said. Julian approached the bed on unsteady legs, feeling as though he were walking through a dream. The baby was impossibly small, red-faced and squalling, with a shock of dark hair that already promised to match his father's. Tiny fingers curled and uncurled, grasping at air as though reaching for something just beyond comprehension. "He is perfect," Julian whispered, hardly daring to breathe. "He is loud." Ilara laughed softly, already asserting his opinions, just like his father. Julian reached out a trembling hand to touch his son's cheek, soft as silk, warm with new life. The baby turned toward the touch instinctively, still crying, and something in Julian's chest cracked open, releasing emotions he had locked away so long ago that he had forgotten they existed. "I never thought," his voice broke. "I never allowed myself to imagine. I know." Ilara reached up to touch his face, wiping away tears he had not realized he was shedding. "But it is real, Julian. He is real. Our son. Our family. Everything we fought for. Everything we hoped for. It is here." He leaned down to kiss her, tasting salt and joy and overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you," he murmured against her lips. "Thank you for saving me, for loving me, for giving me everything I never deserved." "You deserved all of it," she replied firmly. "You always deserved it. You simply needed someone to help you believe that." The baby's cries had softened to whimpers, then quieted entirely as he found his mother's breast and settled into the serious business of nursing. Julian sat beside the bed, unable to look away from the tableau before him. His wife, his son, his family. "Thomas," he thought, "I wish you could see this. I wish you could know that I finally found what you always told me was possible. Love that transforms, that redeems, that makes everything worthwhile." And perhaps it was imagination, perhaps merely the exhaustion and emotion of the day, but he could almost feel his brother's presence in the room. Almost hear his voice, warm with approval, saying what he had always said when Julian doubted himself. "I always knew you had it in you, brother. I always knew." They named the boy Thomas. The choice was Julian's, made without hesitation, the moment Ilara asked what he wished to call their son. She understood immediately, the tribute to the brother he had lost, the hope that this new Thomas might carry forward something of the uncle he would never meet. "Thomas Julian Thorne," she said, trying the name. "Future Duke of Blackthorn, it suits him. He will be better than me." Julian held his son with the careful reverence of a man handling something infinitely precious. "I will ensure it. He will have the advantages I lacked. Stability, love, a father who is present rather than absent. He will not need to become a monster to survive." "He will have the best of both his parents," Ilara agreed. "Your intelligence and determination, and my obviously superior common sense." "Obviously superior?" "Someone has to balance out your tendency toward dramatic brooding. I am simply preparing the next generation." Julian laughed, and Thomas gurgled in response, as though already in on the joke. The years that followed were not without challenges. No life is, no matter how blessed. There were business difficulties that required Julian's attention, social complications that tested Ilara's diplomatic skills, the ordinary struggles of raising children, for Thomas was eventually joined by a sister, Elizabeth, named for the woman Julian's brother had loved and lost. But through every challenge they faced it together, partners, allies, lovers, friends. The Iron Duke learned to be a father, discovered that strength could coexist with tenderness, that power could be used to protect rather than destroy. The reluctant Duchess found her voice in society, became a champion for causes she believed in, used her position to do genuine good in a world that often seemed designed to prevent it. And in the quiet moments, the evenings by the fire, the mornings watching dawn break over the moors, the stolen hours when the children were abed and the house was still, they remembered the journey that had brought them here. The arranged marriage neither had wanted. The first meeting in the library, when Ilara had found a man instead of a monster. The locked room and its shrine to grief. The ball where Julian had declared his love. The crisis that had nearly destroyed them, and the triumph that had proven their bond unbreakable. "Do you ever regret it?" Julian asked one evening, when they were old enough for grey hair and lined faces, when their children had children of their own, and Blackthorn Manor rang with the laughter of a new generation. "The way it began? The circumstances that brought you to me?" Ilara considered the question, as she considered everything, thoughtfully, thoroughly, with the careful attention that had first drawn Julian to her decades ago. "No," she said finally. "How could I regret something that led to this? To you, to our family, to a life more full of love than I ever imagined possible. She reached for his hand, still strong despite the years, still capable of making her heart race with a touch. The beginning was not what either of us would have chosen, but the story we wrote afterward, that was ours. Every chapter, every moment, every choice, ours. Julian raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to the thin skin over her knuckles. I love you, Ilara Thorne. I have loved you since I watched you stand alone under the stars, and I will love you until the stars themselves burn out. Always so dramatic. You married me anyway. I did. She smiled, the same smile that had enchanted him all those years ago, unchanged despite the passage of time. And I would do it again, 1,000 times, 1,000,000, every path, every possibility. I would always choose you. Outside the windows of Blackthorn Manor, the sun set over the Yorkshire moors, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Inside, two people who had begun as strangers and become everything to each other, sat together in the firelight, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a love well earned. Some marriages begin by obligation, but some, the rarest, the most precious, the ones that transform both souls involved, become the greatest adventure of all. And they lived not happily ever after, for life is never so simple, but fully, deeply, with courage and passion and an unshakable commitment to facing whatever came together. Always together. The end. And so concludes the tale of Ilara and Julian, the reluctant Duchess and the Iron Duke, whose marriage began in shadows but ended in light. Thank you so very much for joining us on this journey through Blackthorn Manor and the Yorkshire moors, through fear and hope and the transformative power of love. If this story touched your heart, we would be incredibly grateful if you would take just a moment to subscribe to our channel, so you never miss a new tale of romance and redemption. Leave a comment below telling us what you thought, your favorite moments, the scenes that made you cry, the lines that made you smile. Your words mean more to us than you could possibly know. Please give this story a like if you enjoyed it, and turn on notifications so you will be the first to know when our next romantic adventure begins. Share this story with someone who needs a little romance in their life. We all need more love stories, especially ones that remind us that even the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings. Until next time, dear listeners, may you find your own love story, your own happily ever after, your own someone who sees past your armor to the heart beneath. With all our love and gratitude, until we meet again.